would be quite disconcerting if this were to detonate. Disconcerting, yet provocative.
Welcome, Gothamites, to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City, and now somewhere in upstate New York, she's Dr. Drea Letamendi. Hello, Drea.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I'm excited. This is the very first episode with us covering X-Men, the animated series, previously the Star Trek franchise of movies.
Wait. Oh, I thought you were saying the X-Men animated series was previously known as Star Trek, the franchise.
I want you to continue where we left off with Star Trek by analyzing Xavier and all of his mutie students.
What is the connection?
Yeah.
No. What you're saying is last season we covered Star Trek. This season.
We're in seasons?
Yeah, this is our season of X-Men.
Oh, okay.
By the way, I was thinking about whether we've ever covered X-Men before, and
we have.
We've never covered an X-Men show or film, but we've talked about, if you're counting Scarlet Witch, she's technically
from
an X-Men.
From the universe. So you're correct in that. However, we have specifically spoken about this animated series on 2 panels in the past.
That's right.
There was a writing for animation panel that included Eric and Julia Lewald, David Wise, talked about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. There were maybe someone else. That was a while back. But then WonderCon, I think it's episode 129 of
Is that the one with Chris?
Of our... No. Episode 129 of our podcast, we specifically only talk about X-Men the Animated Series with Eric and Julia Lewald.
We did a panel with them.
Yeah. People can go back and listen to our WonderCon panel.
We also did a panel about the personalities of X-Men or something like that with Chris Claremont.
And Paul Jenkins.
Yeah, we didn't record that one, which is probably for the best.
We did record it.
We did?
We have not released it.
We could talk about that off the air.
Yeah. Ask us about our panel with Chris Claremont and Paul Jenkins. Paul Jenkins, who was absolutely lovely, by the way. So this is our first real trip into X-Men. I have to ask you, though, about your personal relationship with X-Men. We've heard from the very beginning of this podcast that you, of course, grew up with Batman. Your introduction to Batman really and superheroes was Batman the Animated Series. And I'm curious what your relationship with X-Men was, because you might be surprised to know that this show debuted 1 month after Batman. So it was right there in that peak time for you, right there in your wheelhouse.
And we just watched the very first episode of the first season. And I remember seeing that. I've seen that episode a handful of times. I remember the show being on the air. Mm-hmm. It made perfect sense. It's about misfits. It's about people that don't quite fit in. It's about social psychology and culture wars. There's all sorts of really, we'll get into it, but there's lots of interesting themes here.
Yeah.
It's so goth, and yet I didn't watch it. I don't know why I didn't get into it as much. I will say that when I was growing up, I read mostly DC comics, but I had a handful of X-Men comics. I knew about the characters. I watched the animated series here and there when the films came out, which I think was early 90s, mid 90s, when the films started to gain, or the films kind of popularized superhero movies. That was also, it was a franchise that I was paying attention to and really cared for. I didn't get this attachment to it. I in reviewing the themes of the show again and looking at it, I think the palette may have been why. I, again, loved comic books, but
because it was bright and
maybe
colorful.
this was too much.
Yeah.
And it's very action packed, and I wasn't an action kid.
Yeah.
So in a good way, it's action packed. There's lots of from the jump of this first episode, you're in a crisis.
Yeah.
So there's
Like
no
the
delay.
very first thing you see is Sabretooth picking up cars and throwing them, and it's literally
It's a lot.
via a news program. The very first thing you see,
Yeah.
in this animated series.
So there's nothing negative to say, just as far as why I didn't attach to it as much as I attached to other things as a kid.
Right.
But I am really excited to talk about X-Men in general. Of course, the animated series is very nostalgic for a lot of people. I think it carries that for me. That song, despite the fact that I didn't watch it all the time, that song lives in my brain rent-free. It's in there for life.
So what's interesting is I wasn't necessarily going to bring this up, but now I might. That song, which everyone immediately knows, in 2019, a Hungarian television producer sued Fox Kids,
No.
Marvel, Shuki Levy, those folks,
Okay.
for their theme song being a little too close to their TV series. And I actually have a little bit of this series here, Drea. I'm just going to play you the relevant part. But if you know the animated series theme song so well, you tell me if there's any foundation in this.
It's either going to be really distinct, like distinctly a sound alike, or so off, so not the same.
Okay, so here we go. Take a listen.
Okay. Holy bleep. What are all these other sounds going on? The percussion, there's like animal sounds, there's crashing
So
sounds.
this was a Hungarian action adventure show called Lenda from 1984. And
That is uncanny, and I'm using that word right.
yeah.
Like that, like Sue. I as much as I wanted to defend X-Men and their theme song,
Well,
that is beat for beat
So
the same song.
So again, I wasn't necessarily going to bring this up, but because I know some stuff, I'll go ahead and say it. So basically, Haim Saban was brought in to oversee the show, to the production of the show. The music was composed by Ron Wasserman, who's the same gentleman that Haim had used on many shows. After this, Power Rangers would be one of them. Now I'm getting my dates. 93, I think, was Power Rangers. Yeah, right? 93 was Power Rangers. So a year after this, or the following year, Ron Wasserman is doing the music for Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. Interestingly, Haim Saban and his partner Shuki Levy at the time had made a ton of money by being composers of television, animated series, etc. One of the brilliant moves that Haim made was he retained the rights to all the music that they created. So for some animated series that that I worked on the DVDs for, say Inspector Gadget, for instance, you can't use the music outside of context of the show. Otherwise, it triggers royalties and residuals being paid to Haim and Shuki. So in other words, I couldn't use the Inspector Gadget theme song on the menus of the DVDs.
You're kidding.
Because that is a separate use out of context with the TV show. And this is how Haim made a
Holy
bazillion
bleep.
dollars. And so, interestingly, even shows that they are credited for having composed the music for, they probably didn't. They hired ghost composers, some of whom who have come out and sued for money and royalties, and they've settled out of court. And so some of the shows that have the name, music composed by Haim Saban or Shuki Levy aren't actually composed by them. They're composed by ghostwriters. And it is very possible. Haim and Shuki are both Israeli American. This was a Hungarian TV series from 1984. Hungary's a 2-hour plane ride from Israel. So it's very possible they knew this show going into creating this animated series and just decided to tell Ron, we want something that sounds just like this. Give us a sound alike. And
Wow.
Ron did a great job. Now, I'm not suggesting that is what happened. I only know from previous stories and litigation that this is sort of how Hyman...
What resulted from the lawsuit?
I do not know. It was started in 2019, and I have not been able to find any updates as to whether it was settled or whether it went to trial. I do not know. I promise I'll go looking for more.
Yes, let's have this be a side podcast. The story of this mimicked song that is so similar to
really
its
similar.
original source, and who I've never even heard of this before.
And I will say that the rest of that theme song doesn't quite sound like the rest of this theme song. There's a lot. It takes a lot of dramatic turns in that theme song, but that is unmistakably a similar, not an identical, but a similar riff to this
Now
animated
that
series.
one is playing in my head.
Including all of the
all those weird
sound
cacophonous
effects
sounds in the back, like animals shrieking and percussion instruments. That makes me a little sad because I think very highly of the production of the show.
And by the way, we're not blaming Ron. We're not accusing him of anything, and it doesn't take away from just how good. Even if you do take sort of a he then turned it into this song, which is fantastic. It's iconic.
Yeah. Well, before we get into this specific episode, and i.e. these specific characters, where we're introduced to these characters, I know there's plenty of foundation that we certainly don't have time to cover.
Yeah.
But I wondered if you could just give us a good, maybe just a little bit of background, a snapshot of maybe what we need to know. But I also wanted to ask you, before we even started this series, who is your favorite X-Men? It's like a projective psych test. Don't think too hard. Who is the first X person to come to mind?
That's unfair because obviously the first one to come to mind for 90% of people would be Wolverine. But I wouldn't call him. No, I mean, if you said the word X-Men, Wolverine immediately, like, he's synonymous with the term X-Men.
Really? No, that's not the case.
But he's not my favorite.
Yeah. So who's your favorite? Who do you like the most?
Wow.
And why?
That is a crazy, wild question. I say this because I grew up an X-Men fan the same way you grew up a Batman fan. So before I was even reading Batman comics, I was reading X-Men. My very first issue was X-Men 213. I remember it, and if it were in good condition today, it would be worth a pretty penny. It is not in good condition because I read it over and over and over again. I traced every image of that comic over and over and over again. And
Wait, was that the big one?
And the cover is now
Which one is that?
stapled back onto the issue.
Is that the big one that Len introduces all the
No,
new ones?
No, this would be the cover is an extreme close up of Wolverine with some of his cowl sort of shredded, and Sabretooth is right up on it, like they're fighting
I've
each
seen that.
other. And that was my first issue, as well as Classic X-Men #1.
And that's the big one.
I
I'm
bought
thinking
those together. Now you're thinking of the giant-sized X-Men annual or whatever. It says like giant sized on top.
Yeah.
Not that one.
Okay.
But yeah, so I bought those two issues together when a friend of mine took me to the comic shop for the very first time. And he was like, this is what you want to buy. This is what I'm reading. This is what you want. Get X-Men. Great. Took X-Men home, instantly addicted. It's a very Wolverine-centric issue. But I think my favorite might be Rogue.
Really?
If I'm honest, might be Rogue.
Because of the Southern thing.
A good writer will always know just how to give you the sugar and the,
Right.
and the, like the, but I think the thing about Rogue is she's so unassumingly dangerous. She can absorb your powers, and if you're a civilian, your entire just strength, simply by touching you. And in doing so, has acquired powers over her lifetime. So things she was never able to do before. For instance, she acquired Miss Marvel's powers, and now has super strength, the ability to fly. All these powers that we know from Rogue are because she basically took Carol Danvers' powers and has never gotten rid of them.
Wow.
Like she just has this ability. I mean, they were even sharing a body at one point. It was a whole thing. I'm going to need to think more on this, but it might be Rogue.
I think that's excellent.
I like the white.
I didn't expect you to say.
The reddish auburn red hair. She's representing. What about
She's
you?
a cool outfit.
You're a Cyclops. You're a Cyclops chick,
No.
or a Beast. You're a Beast.
Keep guessing.
Oh, you're not.
Sugar? No, I'm kidding.
You're not Beast.
Am I?
If you
Not
love,
really.
like if you love Captain America, if you love those characters, like I would have thought Cyclops. Like he's sort of the paladin of the group. Always does the right thing, sometimes annoyingly so.
Yeah. Emotionally and morally intelligent.
Yeah.
Good leader.
Has a healthy relationship going until it's not.
Yes, but no. That is not and was not my favorite X-person.
Okay.
You also guessed Beast, which is a really good. In
You're
fact,
a science.
when I
kid.
was watching the show once in a while growing up, Beast was the character I absolutely loved. Very smart, and I think there are a handful of characters who are like this. Characters whose mutation is very evident, very outward. We'll talk about some of these themes on the shows.
So Beast, for example, because he is big, blue, and furry, right away.
Yeah,
he's a
so there's something to say about character. Is seen as a monster, but actually is quite, an intellectual, pro-social, doing the science for good. And
but also in a very Spock-like way, will use logic to help determine
analytical. Yes,
how
someone
things
who's
go.
more analytical than they are emotional, and will problem solve their way through a conflict. I
Yeah.
do like that a lot.
Okay.
My favorite X-Men or X-person is Kurt Wagner,
Okay.
aka Nightcrawler.
You're into Nightcrawler, yeah. Germans. You like Germans.
It's kind of what I said before, where you visually see a monster, but this person, in terms of their personality, their internal characteristics, how they care about other people, they're actually quite sensitive.
Yeah.
And I like that. I also love his power.
His ability to bamf.
The bamf, the ability to teleport. And what I love most about that is if he wants to bring someone with him, he hugs them.
Yeah.
And he takes them with him. And I just think
There's something to be said about that.
Such an endearing power, an endearing way to use your power. Complicates things for Rogue, maybe, but
as long as she's covered,
she's gloved.
she should be okay.
Yeah, and I've loved this version in the animated series. I've loved this version in the live action films. I believe the first person to do it was Alan Cumming, and then he's played by, I actually can't remember the actor's name, but someone much younger in the newer films.
Yeah.
But yeah, and he's fantastic in Claremont's God Loves, Man Kills.
Yes.
So
so you know your stuff.
a
You're
comic.
not.
I've read. We have a dear friend, David, who's lent me some Marvel stuff, and
Yeah.
I've been able to take a look at some X-Men stuff as in the now times as an adult, and I love it. It's deep. It's layered. It's cultural. It's very relevant. It's I mean, that one in particular, can't remember when it was written, maybe late 80s, maybe even earlier than that, but it is the beginning of that story
That's a super good story.
is very rough.
Yeah.
It's very traumatic. It's very painful. There's no, we always say, or I think people want to say, X-Men is an allegory for a lot of themes in society. And I'd say, I'm not even sure it's an allegory. It's much more straightforward.
Yeah.
But I'd say, yes, these are stories that are meant to raise consciousness and curiosity and just a real closeness to topics like xenophobia, like religious persecution, like understanding the experiences of minoritized people, of undocumented people, of folks who in our world are othered.
Yeah.
And so
I mean, Bryan Singer himself admitted that he was not really an X-Men fan when he was doing the first movie, until in development someone used the metaphor. They said, think of Charles Xavier as Martin Luther King Jr. and think of Magneto as Malcolm X. And the two of them are now having to combat one another to determine which is the best way to get
for liberation,
for us to be seen, and he said that's when it flipped the switch for him, and suddenly he was really into it. And I think that's the power of the X-Men, the Marvel universe in general, but specifically mutants within the Marvel universe, people who have simply been born into powers they never asked for. These aren't people who were scientists who hit themselves with gamma rays or went up into space and accidentally came back as rock things. These were people who are the next stage of human evolution, and they are being persecuted for it because generations of people don't have these abilities and they're terrified of these things. And so the X-Men do lend themselves to telling really great socially progressive stories.
Yes, I absolutely agree. The interesting thing about X-Men 2 is that a lot of times, I was just talking about Nightcrawler, the fact that his power or his powers involve teleportation, but that has little to do with his physical appearance.
Right.
So it's really interesting as we get down to it, the differences.
And for those that don't know, describe his physical appearance.
Nightcrawler.
Mm-hmm.
Nightcrawler is a dark blue skinned, little kind of devilish humanoid. So a long tail
with the little pointed, the little arrowhead tip. He's got the pointed ears.
Yeah, and he's got the teeth, so some sharp teeth, and then I think the hands are also kind of like grabby. Yes.
Well, all hands are grabby, but he has like two fingers and a thumb. His feet are the same way, like he's got separated, and those help him.
Yeah, so he's
hold
a climber.
He's an acrobat. But he's also so he would be perceived by other people as hellish, as a demon, as a devil, and in fact he is highly religious. In fact, one might even say it basically his relationship to God and religion and Christianity specifically define him as a character. So it's an interesting dichotomy. Mm-hmm. When you look at societies.
I think that's kind of why I like him, because others try to weaponize religion to cast him out and to persecute him.
Yeah.
But he absorbs and connects to religion because of the values surrounding that practice.
Yeah.
And so he kind of shows us how that can be done in a very caring, pro-social, compassionate way, and not in a persecutory way, which is how his enemies use religion. And I think that's a theme that we see commonly, whether it's shape-shifting or mere physical feats, strength, super strength. Mm-hmm. So they all have this double-edged sword, brutality on one side, and maybe the ability to rescue other people on the other side. Each of these powers has that polarized sense to them. Are you going to use it to help people and to protect one another? Are you going to use it to persecute people?
Yeah.
And yet, I think with X-Men especially, their superpower is also, I don't want to say weakness, because they're not, I don't see them as weaknesses, but their superpower can also be the very thing that people hate about them.
That ostracizes them.
Right. Yeah. And so you kind of have to, each of these characters has their own individual unique journey. How do I self-actualize? How do I learn to love myself? How do I integrate all these different parts, my abilities, including this mutant ability, mm-hmm. In a complex way, because that's exactly what people identify as what's wrong with me.
And that's what Charles Xavier is there for. Like, Charles is the one who finds the mutants, brings them back to his school, and basically fosters them. And really, I'm not 1,000% sure on what his doctorate is. I'm sure he's got one in several areas. But he kind of therapizes these people. You could think of it like a rehab facility where these people are brought in to learn how to control and use their powers for good. And that is in between sessions, one-on-one sessions with Xavier, as he is guiding each and every one of these people. And he has selected members of his team to also be instructors at the school and people who can teach these children, because many of them are children.
That is something that I really missed as a youngster, and that makes no sense at all. But watching it now, I realize that a huge part of the storytelling is like the experienced generation. Yeah. Taking the younger generation, the less experienced, under their wing, and not just simply to protect them, but to guide them, to instruct them, to teach them, to kind of give them give them psychological safety, physical safety, this place, this refuge that they can go to. And so as I was thinking about this and watching this first episode, I realized mentorship is a big theme, which will come up for us when we talk about the struggles for a lot of young people, maybe not even necessarily young people, but people exploring their identity in this way. Having someone who is like you, surrounding the characteristics that you are most confused about, that is super psychologically powerful in these stories and in our stories. Like, we really need to have mentors, people who see us and identify the things that we're struggling with. And so I was thinking to myself, oh, mentorship, ex-mentorship, ex-mentors. And I'm probably not the first person to notice this, but I'm going to be using this term for the rest of the season.
Well, and we can talk as the season progresses. It's really more of a comic thing, but we can talk as the season progresses about whether Xavier is raising child soldiers to fight in their war, and how ethical it is for Xavier to have this school in the first place. And is it in any way better, different, or worse than what Batman's doing up at Wayne Manor by recruiting Robins every time one of them graduates or dies? So these are all conversations that we can have. By the way, you mentioned earlier the idea of our favorite characters being a projective test. I want to introduce you to a couple of books that we are going to be using a lot as reference material going forward in these 13 episodes. For those of you who don't know, currently, Dre and I are trying something new for this episode, and we will continue to do so as long as it goes well. We are recording video, and on our Patreon, there is a place there where you can get the video versions of the podcast. Well, I'm about to lift a couple of things up here into frame so that you can see them. I have 2 books that we are going to be referencing a lot during these 13 episodes. One of them is called Previously on X-Men, The Making of an Animated Series. This is by Eric Lewald, who we mentioned before as having been on our podcast before on panels. And the second one is called X-Men, The Art and Making of the Animated Series. This is also by Eric Lewald and his wife, Julia, who was also a writer on the series. Eric is the showrunner. He would have been known then as the showrunner if that term existed. It does today, so we're calling him the showrunner of the X-Men, the animated series. He was chiefly responsible for staffing up, for developing the show, for creating that writer's Bible, which we talked about at great length in the first episode of this podcast, where we talked about Batman's show writer's Bible. Basically, it was his job to make sure they told 13 great stories in this first season, because they thought it would just be one season. But in this book, Previously on X-Men, he brings up the poo sex rule.
What?
The poo sex rule, spelled P-O-O-H as in Winnie. And the reason he brings up this rule that he has created, it is...
I think I know what you're about to say. Can I guess?
Yeah, sure.
If characters don't wear pants, they don't have I'm thinking like biological sex. Like, you're not going to see their
gender?
down under genitalia because they don't have a biological sex, so they don't have to wear pants.
That is incorrect. This is a rule. So basically, Eric and Julia spent a lot of their careers writing for animation. And it was Eric's belief that one of the by far strongest shows when it related to characters was The Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. Because even if you read it on a script, there wasn't a single line of dialogue that you didn't instantly know who was speaking it. So the way that they look is different. The way that they speak is different. The way that they act is different. And so like a projection test, as you just said, are you a poo? Are you a ticker? Are you an Eeyore? It was a show that immediately upon look, you would be able to relate to at least one of these characters. One night when he and his wife Julia were watching Sex and the City, they realized it's the exact same way. Are you a whatever? Because I literally don't know any of their names.
Right.
But are you one of these people? Like, which one are you? Because each one is so distinct that it fits into that category as well. So that's what they were aiming for with this X-Men animated series. So you're not wrong when you say it's a projective test. Which one do you identify with? Which one do you love the most?
Which one and why is that? Is it because you relate to their experiences? Is it because
they just look cool? They have metal claws? Is that why?
But in fairness, and I know that Eric and Julia had a lot of comic book related source material to help with storytelling. These aren't characters who are flimsy. Like, they're not just one dimensional. It's not, they're not so predictable that it becomes boring. It's not gimmicky.
Yeah.
It's much more complex. Their personalities are just fundamentally deep.
Yeah. I mean, Wolverine is one of those characters that you would instantly think on the surface is just going to be a rageful killing machine. And Lord knows he has been a rageful killing machine. Right. But he's also the one character that every young girl mutant seems to latch onto as a brother figure or a father figure, etc. And in this regard, I think Kitty Pryde always gets short rift on screen because in the 80s, especially with Claremont's writing, Wolverine and Kitty Pryde really did develop this amazing chemistry as like an older brother, younger sister relationship that is so incredibly powerful. In fact, this show might have been very different if when in 1989 an animated pilot was made and aired called Pride of the X-Men had been successful. It was not successful, and there's a lot of reason for that, but which we can go into perhaps at a later time. Maybe we'll watch it. But it introduced Kitty Pryde as our proxy into the X-Men. Mm-hmm. And then when that episode didn't do well, this episode, Night of the Sentinels Part 1, introduces Jubilee as that character. And Jubilee would go on to have a father-daughter type relationship with Wolverine. He's incredibly compassionate and knows what it means to be going through what these people are going through. And then in the movies, that Kitty Pryde role is given to Rogue, where suddenly she's the young sister to Wolverine. So Wolverine has a reputation for taking youngsters under his wing, whereas if you looked at him, you would immediately be like, that's the one I'm most terrified of because he's just a rage monster.
I've always wanted to see Colossus in live action films, and I was very disappointed, not with the visual personification of Colossus in that, I don't know, second Deadpool movie, but just I didn't feel that his personality was really coming through.
Oh, that's interesting because that is his personality to some. Like he's super nice.
Yeah, but I felt like
speaking of Kitty Pryde,
maybe just
dumbed him down.
Glossy, yeah. It just made him just the joke, like
sure.
Not a smart, like just a machine, you know.
And he's in X2 very briefly.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, there's a big buff, dark-haired guy who like comes like when guards are breaking into the mansion, he goes into one of the rooms, and for a brief moment you can see him transform into the Colossus metallic bodied character that we know and love. But
I don't remember that. I'll have to look it up.
It's a very short moment, but he's in there briefly and then really realized, like you said in the Deadpool movie. But we'll see. This episode has been a lot about just X-Men in general. It's sort of a primer for this show. And I think part of that is because the first episode of the show is so action driven, but there are a couple of really great moments, particularly with Jubilee, that we learn a lot about her. For instance, she is an orphan. She is a foster child. She has two foster parents, a mother who seems to be she's scared, but seems to be a little more reasonable. And then you've got a father who has behind her back registered her with an organization that is, and this is from the comics as well, they are registering mutants. This is sort of, World War II and the Holocaust. This is report anyone you see who might be a mutant. We need to have them registered. We need to have them numbered. We need to know where they are at all times, because we are going to come for them. And that's exactly what happens. A large sentinel, a gigantic robot, comes in, thrusts his hand through her bedroom window, anticipating retrieving her, but she's already escaped. She has gone off and done what teens do.
She's done the classic bunch up the pillows in the form of a human in your bed and sneak out the window. And
in classic teen form, where does she go?
She goes to the mall.
To the mall, and specifically the arcade.
I was going to say Orange Julius?
Yeah, she is.
Right, the arcade.
She has hit up the arcade.
What's kind of cool about this episode is that the Sentinels are able to ID each mutant. So they scan them. Mm-hmm. They know
through facial recognition.
Yeah, so
AI.
they can tell if they've been registered. They have their name somehow, even if they're unregistered. Oh no, if they're unregistered,
she's registered.
Yeah, so she's registered. So some of the her background comes up, her name, her ethnicity, race, her height. All these kind of facts, and
not her age. Interestingly,
no, it's interesting, not her age, but if you're being introduced to the X-Men, what a cool way to just dive in and not have too much exposition around here's who this person is. And it really does a nice job of introducing probably 5 or 6 characters within the first couple of scenes, and you're able to get to know them.
Yeah. This mall scene is actually directly lifted in some ways off of Jubilee's first appearance in the X-Men comics. I think it's 244, right before 250. I think it's like 244. And Jubilee is at the mall. Several members of the X-Men, all women, decide they're going to go shopping.
Well, that's what women do.
Right. They need to blow off some steam, so they leave. And I think at the time they're in Australia, and they are basically bamfed. They are teleported to the mall in LA. I think they're in like a Hollywood mall, and that's where they come across Jubilee. It's Storm, it's Rogue, Psylocke, Dazzler. I think that's it. I think it's just them. And then they come across Jubilee, who's being confronted by the M Squad, and the X-Men help her and then bring her back.
That's how she's introduced to the X-Men. So
Yeah.
Jubilee, it's interesting. Jubilee knows she's a mutant.
Yes.
She hasn't yet mastered her abilities.
Correct. And her
but she
abilities,
feels-
we should say, are she basically creates fireworks out of her hands. She's able to use, I think at the time that I was reading it, I'm sure science has caught up in some way since then, but they're like plasma bursts of some kind that basically present as fireworks.
Mm-hmm. And she has this sense of knowing generally that her body's producing these electrical
But she
forces.
But she can't control it. Yeah.
And it also seems like even though she's familiar with X-Men, she is not as familiar with them as a culture yet. So I imagine maybe she's seen things on TV. The show, like you said, opens up with news stories. We see the
Anti-mutant
yeah.
rhetoric.
There's already this sense of war between the two, with humans and with mutants, and this sense of like already this persecution happening, this idea that they need to be registered or captured, and that's creating a lot of the whole idea of the wanting to exterminate them, wanting to imprison them, creates this public level conflict.
Yeah.
And we're seeing the results of that, if not riots. Like the way that this is manifesting on the streets is
Yes.
looks scary, it's upsetting,
Yes.
it's chaotic, and that's what's on the news.
Yes.
And so people are conflating the dangerousness and violence of X-Men. They're seeing this surface on TV and equating the X-Men with this level of danger and violence, and I think that's kind of getting commingled in a bad way.
Yeah. And I think if I'm understanding this particular episode, and I could be wrong, it is a two-parter. So in the following episode, we'll touch a lot more on what we're seeing here in these episodes. But I think the X-Men are still sort of underground at this point. Certainly mutants have emerged as being deadly threats to society, but I think the X-Men might not be well known at all at this point, because she's kind of terrified of them, especially at the end when she wakes up in the X-Mansion. And
she flees from them in the mall. She does not want to be a part of X-Men. And I appreciate there's a distinction between X-Men and mutants. And not all mutants are X-Men.
Correct. And so much of that could simply be denial of her own,
And that can make a lot of sense given that what Jubilee is seeing in the news and on TV and in society is that being a mutant is a bad thing.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of internal dissonance there. I know that I'm a mutant. I have these emerging powers. I'm also, Jubilee is a young person, so a teenager coming of age, coming into her own and developing all sorts of feelings about who she is as a person. And then to make things even more complex around identity development, Jubilee is a foster kid.
Yeah.
So lots of messages and concepts and ideas that she's internalizing around, my parents must love me because they chose me, but also I'm not in this family. I'm again, a part of another group that's taken in by this family. Father has registered her. Mother is doing the best that she can. Mm-hmm. And again, those are parents who, and I think the show does a good job of showing this. Those are parents who are struggling to care for their daughter and to create belongingness and create a sense of family, but they have all these external pressures and they've got a government that is specifically telling them that mutants should be a part, they're cast out, they're part of a specific group in society. So this brings up a lot of themes and ideas. We're not going to get to all of them today, but themes around identity development, specifically themes having to do with being in a blended family, a mixed family, multiculturalism, in-betweenness, belongingness, passing, code switching, masking, all the things I'm doing right now as I'm talking. Just layers and layers and tons of topics that come up around the experiences of being a kid of a different culture than your society, your family, your community, and wanting to be a part of this is just a natural human want. You want to belong. You want to be a part of. You want to find your people. Jubilee's people are folks who are specifically being persecuted. Yeah. There's this wholesale extermination of that group. Yeah. Wanting to avoid them makes a lot of sense when it comes to survivorship.
And we should also bring up the fact that she is Chinese American. She is...
You're right. That brings on a whole other layer.
An entirely different layer. She's a young person. She is a woman. She is Chinese American. She is a mutant. She dresses weird. By that I mean a giant yellow trench coat with yellow gloves and blue boots, and it's that color palette that you're you're like, just give me the dark Batman color palette.
Again, there's lots of elements about Jubilee's experience that as a teen myself I would have related to. Yeah. And maybe it was that. Maybe it was too close to home. Maybe I was in a place also doing avoidance. I can speak to these matters now because I've done the therapy work. I've done the developmental work. I've thought a lot. We all continue to actualize our identities well into adulthood. This is a lifelong experience. It's a lifelong journey. So it may be that a lot of us who encountered the show as a kid or as kids felt like this is too much. This is too real. And then I know there are others who have told me they've encountered X-Men or they encountered X-Men when they were children, and it spoke to their experience so much that they did attach. That was what rescued them. That was what made them feel a sense of mattering, visibility. Yeah. My story is in comic books, and I think that meant a lot to youngsters growing up. So
it's that representation that we've always talked about. Yeah. Just being able to see yourself, whether it's your age, your gender, your culture, or even just an allegory that speaks to your personal experience. It is important that everyone gets to see themselves on screen somewhere at some time, and the more of it that we see, the more we all begin to understand all the different facets and all the different experiences going on around us in the world.
Yeah, and just like any comic book, you're going to see monsters, aliens, robots, but it's going to be the people who create the horror. Yeah. Like the horror really are hateful people. I think that's what X-Men comes down to. It comes down to empathy, understanding, really being having an open mind and recognizing hate starts in small ways and can grow to be massive and destructive. Yeah. So I'm really excited to continue the series together and to talk a little bit more about the topics that I've been naming here.
Well, one of the things that I remember about this show, and I'm looking forward to spending more time with it, is that they carried threads throughout the episodes as a longer arc. For instance, a lot of season 1 is going to sort of be that Days of Future Past, and we're already seeing the seeds of that with the Mutant Registration Act. I'm interested to see where this goes. I have not watched this show since it aired, and I remember watching it I was there for every episode. And so now I'm excited of coming back to it as a 46-year-old adult and catching some of the stuff that I didn't catch even as a kid, and as a kid who was well versed in X-Men at the time. So I was watching a lot of the adaptations of stories that I already knew, and I would critique and judge and be ecstatic over some of the things that they were able to adapt for television. So I'm very excited to have this opportunity to go back and look at X-Men the animated series. For those of you who don't know where to find it, if you want to watch along with us, you can find it over at Disney Plus. And hopefully you can just follow along. Drea, why don't you tell the good folks where they can find you online?
You can find me on my website, drdreapsychology.com, or on social media, Dr. Drea Psychology.
You can find me basically on Instagram at bward028. You can find us both on Twitter, for how long I don't know, at Arkham Sessions. You can find us on Instagram at the Arkham Sessions. You can find us, you can email us at arkhamsessions@gmail.com. Leave a message over at SpeakPipe. You could do that by going to drdreapsychology.com and clicking the little button. And join us on Facebook. We're always happy to have you. And Discord. We should mention Discord. The conversations have become pretty lively over there, especially after Star Trek Generations. And we're looking forward to continuing those. So be sure to join our family over at Fanbase Press. And until next time, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Drea Letamendi.
And together we are
the Arkham Sessions.
With style, Petit. With style.